In the summer of 1964, the quiet fishing community of Ravens Lodge was unsettled by the mysterious disappearance of a child. Bobby Chen had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his carved fishing rod by the murky river. But 25 years later, when fishing guide Rex stumbles upon a hidden shrine deep in the Alaskan wilderness, he uncovers a truth so horrifying it would unravel the very fabric of his understanding and lead to the most chilling revelation imaginable. The morning Bobby Chen disappeared began like any other at the remote lodge. Mist clung to the Tongass River like ghostly fingers, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and wood smoke from the main cabin's chimney. The 11-year-old had been restless during the family's week-long vacation, his small hands fidgeting with everything he touched, his dark eyes darting constantly toward the dense forest that pressed against the lodge's weathered buildings. Dr. James Chen had brought his family to this isolated corner of Alaska, hoping the wilderness would calm his son's increasingly erratic behavior. The boy had been having episodes, sudden outbursts, nightmares, an inability to focus that worried his parents. Perhaps the rhythm of casting lines into dark water would provide the peace their suburban San Francisco home could not. Bobby's mother, Elena, had noticed her son talking to himself by the river that morning, his voice barely audible above the water's gentle murmur. When she called him for breakfast, he didn't respond. His attention seemed fixed on something across the water, something she couldn't see. At 10:47 a.m., Elena found Bobby's fishing rod propped against the wooden dock's edge. The rod itself was unremarkable, a simple wooden pole Gus had carved for young guests. But the dock beneath it bore fresh scratches in the weathered planks, deep grooves that resembled symbols, though Elena couldn't decipher their meaning. The river moved past the empty dock with indifferent silence. Bobby's footprints led to the water's edge and simply stopped, as if the earth itself had swallowed the boy whole. The forest beyond offered no answers, only the whisper of wind through ancient spruce and the distant cry of ravens circling overhead. By noon, every adult at Ravens Lodge was searching. But Bobby Chen had vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind only questions that would haunt this remote place for decades to come. 3 days before Bobby's disappearance, Gus Thornfield had welcomed the Chen family to Ravens Lodge with his usual gruff warmth. The lodge owner's calloused hands gestured toward the main cabin as he explained the week's activities: fishing expeditions, nature walks, and evening storytelling around the fire pit. But it was the quiet man standing beside Gus who caught Dr. Chen's attention. "This here's Dr. Morrison," Gus said, his weathered face brightening. "Real fortunate timing. He's visiting us for a few weeks, doing some research on wilderness therapy for troubled youngsters." Dr. Morrison stepped forward with a gentle smile, his soft brown eyes crinkling at the corners. He was perhaps 50, with thinning grey hair and the kind of unremarkable face that belonged in a crowd. Dr. Morrison's handshake was firm but brief. "Please call me David," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent Elena couldn't place. "I couldn't help but notice your son seems quite energetic. Sometimes the wilderness can work wonders for children who struggle with focus." Dr. Chen exchanged a glance with his wife. Bobby had indeed been difficult during the long journey north, fidgeting in the car, asking endless questions, unable to sit still during their overnight stop in Juneau. "He's been having some behavioral issues," Dr. Chen admitted quietly. "Perfectly normal," Morrison assured them, pulling a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket. He made a brief notation, then tucked it away. "I found that certain traditional activities, fishing, hiking, even simple crafts can help channel that restless energy. With your permission, I'd be happy to work with Bobby during your stay." Elena felt a wave of relief. Here was a professional, someone who understood children's difficulties. "That's very kind of you, Dr. Morrison." "David, please." His smile never wavered. "I find children respond better to informal relationships, less clinical, more natural. As he spoke, his
I'm
fingers
sure you
absently
understand how
traced
important
small
it is to keep
patterns in the
things
air
secure.
circles and lines that meant nothing to the Chens, but would later prove significant. Gus clapped Morrison on the shoulder. "Doc's been a godsend around here. Real good with the kids who visit." Neither parent noticed how Morrison's gaze lingered on Bobby, or how carefully he observed the boy's every movement with the practiced eye of someone conducting an assessment. On Bobby's second day at the lodge, Dr. Chen was examining a collection of wooden artifacts displayed in the main cabin when the front door opened with unusual force. A tall man with silver-streaked black hair entered, without knocking his dark eyes immediately, finding Dr. Chen among the scattered fishing gear and mounted trophy salmon. "You are the collector," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty rather than question. Joseph Carhart moved with the fluid precision of someone intimately familiar with the wilderness, his weathered face set in hard lines. "I know what you've been doing in our sacred places." Dr. Chen's hand froze over a carved wooden mask. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "The university contacted our tribal council 6 months ago," Joseph interrupted, stepping closer, "asking about research permissions for areas that have been closed to outsiders for generations." His eyes swept over the artifacts Dr. Chen had been studying. "These pieces, they're not supposed to be here." Gus emerged from the kitchen, dish towel in hand. "Now Joseph, Dr. Chen's just a guest here." "The fishing grounds by the Red Cedar Grove." Joseph continued, ignoring Gus entirely. "The burial sites near the waterfall. Your people have been taking things that don't belong to them." His gaze fixed on Dr. Chen with uncomfortable intensity. "Sacred objects have power. When you steal them, that power turns against you." From across the room, Dr. Morrison looked up from the nature guide he'd been reading to Bobby. His expression remained pleasantly neutral, but his fingers had stopped turning pages. He watched the confrontation with the focused attention of someone cataloguing every word. "I haven't taken anything," Dr. Chen protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Joseph's knowing look suggested he was aware of more than Dr. Chen wanted to admit. "The spirits of this place protect their own," Joseph said softly. "When sacred ground is disturbed, when ancient things are stolen, the forest remembers. It takes back what was taken." He glanced toward Bobby, who had stopped listening to Morrison's explanation about local bird species. "Children are particularly sensitive to such disturbances." Joseph turned toward the door, then paused. "Keep your family close, Dr. Chen. The forest has been restless lately." The morning after Joseph's warning, Gus Thornfield sat hunched over a stack of papers in his small office behind the main lodge, the harsh fluorescent light casting deep shadows under his eyes. The documents spread across his desk told a story of mounting desperation overdue, mortgage payments, equipment loans in default, and a business insurance policy that had been his last hope for financial salvation. The sound of boots on the wooden porch announced unwelcome visitors before they knocked. Through the window, Gus could see 2 men in dark suits, their urban appearances jarringly out of place against the wilderness backdrop. Insurance investigators from Anchorage, arriving 3 days earlier than scheduled. "Mr. Thornfield?" The taller investigator, Reynolds, had the kind of persistent politeness that made Gus's stomach clench. "We need to discuss some irregularities in your recent claims." Gus quickly shuffled the papers into a drawer, but not before Reynolds' sharp eyes caught sight of the red-stamped "Final Notice" headers. The lodge owner's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the smoke mixing with the scent of desperation that seemed to permeate the small room. "Business has been slower than expected," Gus admitted, his voice hoarse. "Tourist season's not what it used to be." Reynolds made notes in a small pad while his partner examined the lodge's guest registry. We understand you've had some creative approaches to boosting revenue, claims for equipment theft, minor structural damage from storms that weather services have no record of. Through the thin office walls, they could hear Dr. Morrison's gentle voice explaining forest safety rules to Bobby and the other children gathered for their morning nature walk. The sound provided an oddly innocent counterpoint to the tension building in the cramped office. "That boy who went missing," the second investigator said casually, not looking up from the registry. "Terrible timing right when we were planning to review your policies. Family like that wealthy doctor from San Francisco, they'd likely have significant resources for recovery efforts." Gus's cigarette burned down to his fingers, but he didn't seem to notice. Outside, Bobby's laughter echoed across the clearing as Morrison demonstrated proper knot-tying techniques. The sound carried an eerie quality in the morning air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The investigators exchanged meaningful glances. Desperation made men do unthinkable things, and Augustus Thornfield appeared to be a man with nothing left to lose. By the second day of Bobby's disappearance, the search had transformed from hopeful calling into methodical desperation. Dr. Morrison had emerged as the unofficial coordinator of volunteer efforts, his calm demeanour providing stability when emotions threatened to overwhelm the scattered search parties. "We need to be systematic," Morrison explained to the assembled volunteers, spreading a hand-drawn map across the lodge's main table. His precise handwriting marked grid sections, potential hazards, and previously searched areas with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to detailed documentation. The boy was last seen near the dock, but children often wander farther than adults expect. Eleanor Chen watched Morrison organize the searches with growing gratitude. While her husband argued with state troopers about bringing in helicopters and Gus chain-smoked on the porch, Morrison remained focused on practical solutions. He assigned teams to different sectors, established check-in times, and even prepared emergency supplies for the volunteers. Dr. Chen mentioned Bobby had been having some difficulties at school, Morrison said quietly to Eleanor as they walked toward the forest's edge. Concentration issues, behavioral outbursts. His tone was professionally sympathetic, the voice of someone gathering information to help. "He's been restless," Eleanor admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Angry sometimes. His teachers said he was disruptive, but he's just a little boy." "Of course," Morrison nodded, making a mental note. "And the episodes, how long have they been occurring? Were there any triggers you noticed?" As they spoke, Morrison's hands moved constantly, adjusting his jacket, checking his watch, tapping rhythmic patterns against his thigh. The gestures seemed nervous, understandable given the circumstances, but the patterns were too precise, too deliberate for mere anxiety. Sometimes he would just stop talking, Elena continued, desperate to share her fears with someone who seemed to understand. For hours, like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. Morrison's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Auditory hallucinations can be quite common in children under stress, he said carefully. Did he ever mention what he was hearing? Deep in the forest, a search team called out Bobby's name, their voices echoing off the ancient trees. Morrison tilted his head, listening to the sound with an expression that briefly shifted from concern to something else, a flicker of calculation that passed too quickly for Elena to interpret. "We'll find him," Morrison assured her, his gentle smile returning. "I have a feeling Bobby is closer than we think." On the third morning of the search, Joseph Carhart appeared at the edge of the clearing like a shadow materializing from the forest itself. He carried no supplies, no map, yet moved with the confidence of someone who knew every game trail and hidden creek for 50 miles in any direction. The search volunteers, exhausted and increasingly desperate, watched him with a mixture of hope and unease. "The boy is not where you're looking," Joseph announced, his dark eyes scanning the organized chaos of the search operation. White men always search in straight lines, like the forest follows your rules, Doctor. Morrison looked up from his clipboard pen poised over another carefully marked grid. Mr. Carhart, we'd welcome any suggestions about areas we might have missed. Joseph's laugh held no warmth. You think I help you find what the forest has claimed? His weathered hands gestured toward the dense spruce that pressed against the lodge's boundaries. Some disappearances are meant to be permanent. The volunteers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elena Chen stepped forward, her face streaked with tears and 3 days of sleepless searching. Please, she whispered. He's just a child. Your husband disturbed sacred places, Joseph replied, his voice carrying an edge that made several searchers step back. Took things that weren't his to take. The spirits of this land don't forget such violations. What chilled the onlookers wasn't just Joseph's words, but his intimate knowledge of the terrain. He spoke of hidden ravines that didn't appear on any map of ancient paths that twisted through the deepest forest of places, where a small boy could disappear forever without leaving a trace. When pressed for specifics, Joseph's answers came too quickly, too precisely. There's a clearing about 4 miles northeast, he said, pointing toward a section of forest the search teams hadn't yet reached. Old ceremonial ground. The ancestors wouldn't take kindly to trespassers. Morrison made careful notes as Joseph spoke, his pen capturing every detail with clinical precision. But when Joseph described the traditional warnings left for those who violated sacred spaces, carved symbols, deliberate markings, Morrison's hand momentarily stilled. As Joseph melted back into the forest, as silently as he'd arrived, the volunteers began preparing for another day of searching. None of them noticed how closely Morrison had been studying Joseph's directions, or how the elderly Tlingit man's description of ceremonial markings matched exactly the symbols carved into the dock where Bobby's fishing rod had been found. That afternoon, while the search teams pressed deeper into the wilderness, following Joseph's cryptic directions, a different kind of discovery unfolded back at the lodge. Elena Chen was gathering her husband's belongings when she found the letters hidden beneath false bottom of his medical bag, a collection of correspondence that revealed a side of Dr. James Chen she had never known existed. The first letter, postmarked 3 weeks before their Alaska trip, carried an official letterhead from a private antiquities dealer in Seattle. The language was polite but unmistakably threatening. Dr. Chen, your failure to deliver the promised ceremonial pieces has put our mutual arrangement in jeopardy. Our clients have invested considerable resources based on your assurances. Elena's hand shook as she read deeper into the correspondence. Her husband, whom she'd believed was conducting legitimate anthropological research, had apparently been stealing and selling indigenous artifacts for months. The letters detailed specific items, sacred masks, ceremonial daggers, burial totems, and the substantial sums of money involved. A second letter, dated just days before Bobby's disappearance, was more direct. Time is running out, Doctor. Our associates in Alaska have been informed of your location. Perhaps a reminder of what you stand to lose will motivate quicker compliance. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his soft footsteps having gone unnoticed on the wooden floor. Mrs. Chen, I was checking to see if you needed anything. His gentle eyes took in the scattered letters, the telltale expressions of shock and betrayal crossing Elena's face. I don't understand, Elena whispered, holding up a detailed inventory of stolen artifacts. James never told me about any of this. Morrison moved closer, his professional demeanor shifting into something more calculated. May I? When Elena nodded numbly, he examined the letters with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reviewing important documents. His fingers traced certain phrases, lingering over specific names and locations with more familiarity than a wilderness therapy researcher should possess. "These people," Morrison said quietly, "they're quite serious about their business arrangements. Professional artifact smuggling involves significant money and dangerous individuals." He looked up at Elena with what appeared to be genuine concern. "It's possible Bobby's disappearance isn't random at all." Outside, the search team's voices grew fainter as they followed Joseph's directions deeper into the forest, unaware that the most important clues to Bobby's fate might not lie in the wilderness, but in the carefully documented criminal activities of his own father. The discovery came from an unexpected source. While Eleanor grappled with her husband's hidden criminal activities, Gus's elderly handyman Frank was replacing rotted floorboards in the lodge's storage shed. His crowbar struck something solid beneath the warped planks, a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth hidden for years beneath the building's foundation. Inside the makeshift time capsule, Frank found a collection of items that made his weathered face go pale: children's belongings, personal effects, and most disturbing of all, a guest registry from 1961 that Gus had apparently thought was lost. The names written in fading ink told a story that chilled Frank to his bones. Timothy Walsh, age 9, behavioral difficulties. Shishi. Sarah Connors, age 12, psychiatric evaluation recommended. Michael Torres, age 10, treatment for aggressive episodes. 7 children in total, all listed as staying at the lodge during summers when Dr. Morrison had been conducting his research. Frank's memory, sharpened by decades of maintenance work around the lodge, began filling in details he'd previously dismissed as unimportant. Each of these children had spent significant time with Morrison, participating in his specialized therapeutic activities away from their families. Each had shown remarkable improvement during their stay, according to the careful notes Morrison kept. And each had vanished during hiking expeditions or solo fishing trips, leaving behind only personal belongings and traumatized families. When Frank brought the box to Gus, the lodge owner's face went ashen. "Jesus Christ," Gus whispered, recognizing the implications immediately. "The insurance payouts, the search and rescue costs. I always wondered why Morrison was so helpful with the paperwork afterward." Through the window, they could see Morrison returning from the latest search effort, his clothing pristine, despite hours in the wilderness, his demeanor as calm and professional as ever. He carried Bobby's small backpack, found he claimed near a creek bed 2 miles from the lodge. He always found something, Frank realized aloud. Every single time a kid went missing, Morrison was the one who discovered the evidence that ended the search. Morrison approached the main cabin with measured steps, the backpack held carefully in his hands, like evidence he was preserving. But as he passed the window where Gus and Frank watched, both men noticed something that made their blood run cold. Morrison's lips were moving silently, and his free hand was tracing those same precise patterns in the air circles and lines that now seemed less like nervous gestures and more like someone practicing a presentation. 25 years passed before the truth began to surface. Rex Harmon had been guiding fishing expeditions through the Tongass wilderness for over a decade, when the unusually dry summer of 1989 revealed secrets the forest had kept hidden. The creek beds ran lower than anyone could remember, exposing rock formations and fallen logs that hadn't seen daylight in decades. It was while tracking a particularly elusive salmon run that Rex noticed the unnatural arrangement of stones beneath a massive fallen cedar. What appeared to be random forest debris revealed itself upon closer inspection as something deliberately constructed, a shrine hidden so expertly that only prolonged drought could have made it visible. The structure was approximately 6 feet across, built from weathered totemic poles arranged in a precise circle. Between the carved wooden sentinels, Rex found objects that made his breath catch in his throat, A child's fishing rod, its wooden surface bearing the same carved symbols he'd seen on old dock planks at the abandoned Raven's Lodge. A small backpack, its fabric miraculously preserved by the shrine's careful construction. Personal items, a compass, a jackknife, photographs that spoke of multiple victims across many years. But it was the collection of indigenous artifacts that truly revealed the shrine's purpose. Ceremonial masks, carved totems, and sacred objects lay arranged with ritualistic precision, as if someone had been conducting elaborate ceremonies in this hidden clearing for decades. The artifacts were clearly valuable museum-quality pieces that belonged in tribal collections, not mouldering in a forest shrine. Beneath the artifacts, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth, Rex discovered a leather-bound journal. The first entry was dated June 15, 1961, written in precise handwriting that belonged to someone accustomed to keeping detailed records. Subject exhibits classic symptoms of attention deficit with underlying behavioral dysregulation. The entry began, "Traditional pharmaceutical interventions have proven insufficient. The isolation provided by wilderness setting offers unique opportunities for experimental approaches without institutional oversight or parental interference." As Rex read deeper into the journal, his hands began to tremble. Page after page documented psychological experiments conducted on children, detailed observations of their responses to various treatments, and clinical notes about behavioral modification techniques that belonged in the darkest chapters of medical history. The signature at the bottom of each entry was consistent: Dr. David Morrison, MD, Psychiatric Research Division. The shrine wasn't a monument to cultural revenge or criminal retaliation. It was a trophy case. The journal's pages revealed a methodical monster disguised as a healer. Dr. David Morrison had been conducting unauthorized psychiatric experiments on vulnerable children for over 2 decades, using the remote Alaskan wilderness as his private laboratory and Raven's Lodge as an unwitting recruitment center. Rex's hands shook as he read Morrison's clinical descriptions of his subjects. The doctor had specifically targeted children with behavioral issues, those whose parents were desperate enough to accept help from a stranger whose symptoms could be explained away if the treatments went wrong. Bobby Chen fit the profile perfectly, restless prone to outbursts, struggling with focus issues that frustrated his educated parents. The isolation protocol proves most effective, Morrison had written in neat, precise handwriting. Removed from familiar environments and support systems, subjects become significantly more compliant. The combination of wilderness, disorientation, and controlled pharmaceutical intervention creates optimal conditions for behavioral modification research. The journal documented a horrifying progression. Morrison would gain the trust of families volunteer to help with their troubled children, then gradually separate his victims from their parents under the guise of therapeutic activities. Deep in the forest, beyond the reach of witnesses or rescue, he conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and psychological torture. Entry after entry detailed Morrison's methodology. Sensory deprivation techniques, disguised as meditation exercises, experimental drugs administered through vitamin supplements, psychological conditioning masked as wilderness survival training. The children who survived his initial treatments became subjects for increasingly invasive procedures. But it was the final entries about each child that made Rex's stomach clench with horror. When Morrison's experiments reached their conclusion, whether through the subject's death or their complete psychological breakdown, he would stage elaborate disappearances. The carved symbols on the dock, the carefully placed evidence, the helpful coordination of search efforts, all designed to direct suspicion toward other parties, while Morrison positioned himself as the concerned helper. Subject B. Chen showed remarkable resistance to standard conditioning protocols. Read the final entry about Bobby. Increased pharmaceutical intervention required. Subject's father's criminal activities provide excellent cover for staged abduction scenario. Local indigenous tensions offer additional misdirection opportunities. The shrine wasn't just a trophy case, it was Morrison's private museum, a monument to decades of medical experimentation hidden behind the facade of wilderness therapy. And according to the journal's final pages, dated just months before Rex's discovery, Dr. David Morrison was still actively practicing. The most chilling revelation lay in Morrison's detailed methodology for selecting and manipulating his victims. The journal contained what could only be described as hunting notes, systematic observations of families, psychological profiles of potential subjects, and elaborate strategies for gaining parental trust through manufactured medical authority. Target identification requires careful observation of family dynamics. Morrison had written in a section titled Acquisition Protocols. Ideal subjects present with documented behavioral irregularities that create parental anxiety. Parents must demonstrate sufficient desperation to accept outside intervention while possessing adequate financial resources to justify extended therapeutic engagement. Rex discovered that Morrison had been visiting remote lodges, wilderness camps, and family resorts across Alaska and northern Canada for decades, always appearing as a legitimate medical professional conducting research. He carried falsified credentials, fabricated letters of recommendation, and an encyclopedic knowledge of psychiatric terminology that convinced desperate parents he was their salvation. The Chen family had been perfect targets. Dr. James Chen's own medical background made him susceptible to professional courtesy and peer respect. Elena's maternal anxiety about Bobby's behavioral issues created emotional vulnerability Morrison could exploit. Most importantly, their week-long stay at an isolated lodge provided the extended access Morrison needed for his work. Initial contact with Chen family proceeded according to standard protocol. Morrison had documented. Father exhibits typical physician arrogance, assumes colleague status, eliminates need for credential verification. Mother demonstrates classic maternal guilt patterns regarding child's behavioral symptoms. Subject shows optimal combination of intelligence and psychological instability. The journal revealed how Morrison had spent those first 2 days at the lodge carefully studying Bobby, documenting the boy's responses to various stimuli, mapping his psychological vulnerabilities. The therapeutic activities were actually assessment sessions designed to determine Bobby's suitability for the experimental procedures Morrison had planned. Most disturbing were Morrison's notes about the other suspects. He had deliberately cultivated tensions between Dr. Chen and Joseph, knowing that the artifact theft would provide convenient misdirection. He had observed Gus's financial desperation and calculated how the lodge owner's insurance problems would deflect suspicion. Every detail of the investigation had been choreographed by Morrison from the beginning. The beauty of wilderness disappearances. Morrison had written lies in their inherent plausibility. Nature provides countless explanations for missing children, while isolation prevents thorough investigation. Properly staged, such incidents generate sympathy rather than suspicion for the helpful professional who coordinates search efforts. Rex closed the journal with trembling hands and looked at the hidden shrine one last time. 25 years after Bobby Chen's disappearance, the truth had finally surfaced from the depths of the Alaskan wilderness. The weathered totemic poles stood like silent sentinels around decades of evidence bearing witness to crimes that should never have been allowed to continue for so long. The state troopers who responded to Rex's radio call arrived by helicopter 6 hours later. Among them was Detective Sarah Morrison. No relation to the doctor, despite sharing his surname, who had been investigating missing children cases across Alaska for most of her career. As she examined the shrine's contents, her expression shifted from professional interest to horrified recognition. "We've been looking for this connection for years," she told Rex, as crime scene technicians carefully documented each artifact, each piece of evidence. Missing children from remote locations, always with helpful adults who coordinated search efforts. Dr. David Morrison has been using false identities across 3 provinces and 2 states. The investigation that followed revealed Morrison's true scope. He had been conducting unauthorized experiments for over 30 years, always moving to new locations before suspicion could build, always presenting himself as a legitimate researcher helping troubled children. The shrine contained evidence linking him to at least 15 disappearances, with Bobby Chen being neither his first nor his last victim. Morrison himself was arrested 3 months later at a wilderness camp in northern Manitoba, where he had been preparing to begin work with another group of vulnerable children. The quiet, helpful doctor who had coordinated Bobby's search efforts was finally revealed as one of the most prolific child killers in North American history. As Rex walked away from the excavated shrine site, he looked at the ancient forest one last time. The real journey was just beginning for the families who would finally learn their children's fates, for the communities that had trusted a monster, for the wilderness that had kept its dark secrets for so long. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but truth endures even when buried beneath decades of careful deception. As he reached his truck, Rex squeezed his radio handset tight. "At least now they can rest," he whispered to the forest. The trees rustled in response, as if finally exhaling a breath held for 25 years. They stepped toward healing, toward a future they would build one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.